Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Careening Towards Fascism. I'm Jen.
I'm Sandy. It's good to be back again.
It is good to be back again, although I guess we kind of wish that we didn't have to be, but I guess that's the world we're in at the moment.
Maybe we'd have another alternate timeline, another more positive, upbeat podcast.
Yeah, it would be like careening away from fascism. Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be.
Maybe we'll hang around long enough to see that happen in the course of the next couple of years. We can hope.
We can hope. And maybe even play our own little part in all of this.
That's all we can do, is try to play our own little part. And speaking about playing our own little part and who's playing whose part, that leads nicely into the topic of this week's episode.
Kudos to you.
Thanks. I appreciate it. We're going to talk about the reaction of political parties to what Trump is doing, both the Democrats and the Republicans, and how that compares with how political parties responded or didn't respond to Hitler and the Nazi government of the 1930s. Let's talk, I guess, first about what we're seeing today in terms of what the political parties in the U.S. are doing in terms of responding.
Well, if I would use a general word I would use is apathy. Apathy from the Democrats, the odd noble exceptions such as Elizabeth Warren and some governors and the governor of Illinois and the like. But in general, there seems to be, as we were just talking earlier on, Chuck Schumer seems to believe it's up to the courts to stop.
Yeah, I was looking at Chuck Schumer's, what he's been saying earlier today. Not what he was saying earlier today, but earlier today I was looking at what he was saying. And he's, of course, the Democratic leader in the Senate, now the minority leader in the Senate. And I noticed on February 11th, and I feel like this kind of sums up sort of what he's been doing or what he's not been doing. He starts off, this was a tweet or a post on X.
Twitter, please.
What's that?
Twitter, please.
Well, exactly. That's why I said it in such a fancy and silly voice, because I refuse to call it that. All right, so here's what he tweeted. And I think he starts off quite strong. Donald Trump does not reign supreme. The law is not optional for him. He is an executive, not a monarch. Yes. Congress makes the laws. Courts interpret our laws. We all learned that in grade school. And the courts will be an important venue for holding Donald Trump accountable. I mean, this seems to be, from what I've observed, this is what to me is the problem with a lot of how the Democratic leaders have been responding, which is that here's Chuck Schumer basically saying, we shall sit back and let the courts take care of it. And maybe they will, but are you going to wait for it to get to that point? Are we going to wait for things to wind their way through the Supreme Court, at which point they may or may not be stopped? I mean, is that really the role of Democratic leaders here?
And also considering that Trump has already packed the Supreme Court in his favor, and they've already shown their willingness to tend to an imperial executive power. Yeah. And Chuck Schumer also in an interview a few weeks ago also talked about the real battle would be the midterms. That they had to keep waiting until the midterms. But the thing is, what do you do when your democracy is eroded in days?
Yeah, truly. What's going to happen in the next 2 years, right?
Yeah, and that's the challenge that the Democratic leadership must rise to, and they're failing. They are failing abysmally. As I said,
they're just not doing anything. To me, they're playing by the old playbook, which is, this is fine. They're like the dog in the burning room. This is fine. Everything is fine. But it's not. It's not.
And one of the questions you have to ask, why do they prefer the old playbook instead of, looking at changing realities? And one of the things that was becoming clear during the presidential election was that young voters were not as enthusiastic for the Democrats as the Democrats had hoped. And one of the possibilities is that the Democrats are too reliant upon corporate sponsorship, corporate donors. And young people weren't really interested in the corporate Democrat Party, as it were. What they wanted was a Democrat Party that would meet their needs, that would fight for their causes. And one of their causes was Many of them had supported Bernie Sanders when he had made his nomination, and Bernie Sanders offered a vision of democratic socialism, not communism, not the socialism of the Warsaw Pact or anything like that, but socialism that meant something to people's lives.
And I will point out that Bernie Sanders, to me, has been one of the few voices that has come out strongly against Trump and has clearly stated what's going on and has really put out some calls to action.
Yeah.
And I think has been a leader where we're not seeing that. And he's not a Democrat. He's an independent.
He's an independent in the caucuses. Another person who actually would seem to be ringing alarm bells was Angus King, who is a senator from Maine. Once more, he's an independent who often caucuses with the Democrats.
Yeah.
But because of his position, like Bernie Sanders, he's able to be more aware of what's going on, more aware.
Or at least is more free to act how he wants.
It's not,
or, maybe he just isn't stuck in the old way of looking at things. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that, young people have a different view of socialism. Young people did not grow up in the Cold War. Those of us who grew up in the Cold War were told that socialism was bad. Young people don't link socialism with the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, and all that. They link it with Canada. They'll link it with public health care. They'll link it with education and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so when they talk about socialism, they talk about socialism that means something to people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've seen the Democrats actually, some of them, voting in favor of the nominees for the various cabinet positions that Trump has put forth, all of whom have, let's say, serious questions around their abilities and their ideologies. We've seen some Democrats voting in favor of them, quite a few. And then we have the Republicans who have voted unanimously for these nominees, have done nothing to pump the brakes at all, from what I understand, on what Trump is doing. Moderate Republicans, and I know there are some, haven't been saying much of anything. They're just sitting back and letting this happen. I mean, you don't expect as much from them as you might from the Democrats, but you might expect something.
The official explanation I've seen in some places, in some articles, is that they say they're in fear. They're in fear of the MAGA. They're in fear of the kind of retaliations for the resistance, whatever. To be honest, I think that's a useful explanation, a useful excuse.
Yeah.
They don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah.
An American politician relies upon what they do in their time of office to start making more money through lobbying once they quit.
Yeah.
If you rock the boat, you don't get the lobbying dollars once you're finished.
No, I mean, I think that's a very fair point.
When you look at the figures about how wealthy American politicians are, like I remember during the presidential election, the Republicans were quite surprised when they saw how poor, in comparison, Tim Walz was, because he was just a regular teacher pension. He had his governor pension and all this kind of stuff, but no millions of dollars. Yeah. And so as one Republican commentator, and no Trump Republican, said, if these senators and congressmen were genuinely concerned for the security, they could ask for more security.
Yeah. You mean like their physical security?
Their physical security.
Yeah.
If they're worried about death threats,
right,
there is the protection for them.
Yeah.
I think it's just a useful excuse to justify their inaction.
Mm-hmm.
They would rather be known as cowards than be willing to stand up and lose the political clout of being part of the winning regime, as it were.
Yeah, I tend to agree. So we're not seeing a lot of action from the mainstream parties here, from the Democrats and the Republicans. We're seeing a little bit from independents. Yeah. We're seeing a little bit from governors. I'll say that some governors have been speaking up because they're in a different position.
The governor of Maine recently challenged Trump during a meeting when he started talking about imposing federal rules on transgendered and the like, and she said, "We'll see you in court."
Yeah, that was awesome.
And the governor of Illinois, he has also been very clear that he believes in standing up for the rights of his people of his state. The governor of California has also been very clear that they will fight for American freedoms, American values, American liberty. And if that means resisting Trump, well, that's the plan. That's what they'll do.
I'm liking that. I mean, it's good to see that at least at that level of government in the U.S., things seem to be at least somewhat functional in terms of like being aware of the reality of what's happening and being willing to say something. They obviously are in a different position than people who are in Washington.
Yeah.
And in that kind of sucked up in that milieu.
Well, you can say that, but the simple fact is people like Chuck Schumer and his ilk swore an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States. What they're doing is an abject failure of standing up for that. That oath.
Absolutely.
They're leaving it to, they're trying to kick the problem further down because they don't want to upset the apple cart. They believe that once they're back in power, they'll have the same kind of goodies. And they'll probably think to themselves, if Trump can get away with this kind of stuff, maybe we can get away with it when we're in.
You got to wonder. Let's talk about how this compares with how the various political parties responded to what Hitler was up to. I mean, there was some that cooperated and some that tried to oppose him. So why don't you talk to us about those?
First, the political situation in terms of political parties was much more fractured. There was not two parties. There was a multitude of parties. It'd probably be best to look at factions rather than parties. There was the nationalists of various degrees who believed in the good old days of the German Reich. Centrist parties representing various constituencies, like there was a Catholic party called the Zentrum, and regional parties representing various regions such as Bavaria and such. And then there was the SPD, the Socialist Party, and then the KPD, which was the communists.
Right.
So you had a multitude of parties, and one of the reasons that Germany had struggled was that there was no clear winner in many elections, so they had to form coalitions and such and such and such and such. When Hitler was put into power as chancellor, he was appointed by a cabal of reactionary politicians, right-wing, very conservative, who believed they could use him. And the parties that they represented went along with it. So when he became chancellor, he called for elections. The Nazis still did not get an absolute majority. So to start his process of establishing the Nazi state, he wanted to pass which was called the Enabling Act, and we'll talk more about that later on down the line.
We will.
But what you need to know at this point is the Enabling Act was the legal basis of the Nazi state. It gave it legitimacy. Right.
This wasn't a coup. This was something that was done via the usual steps for legislation.
It was definitely not a coup, because what happened was he needed a extensive majority in the Reichstag, the German parliament, and he was able to persuade these political parties to vote for it.
And why did they?
Because Hitler was seen as the lesser of two evils. They saw him as the bulwark to protect the German state against the socialists and the communists. The socialists and the communists were perceived as a threat to public order because they didn't follow the same playbook as the Zentrum, the nationalists, and, dare I say it, the Nazis as well. They had a different ideology, a different vision, a more egalitarian vision of Germany, a more, support the workers, support the ordinary people, down with the oligarchs, that kind of language, down with the elites. And the moderate parties, the liberal parties, the centrist parties were middle class parties, and saw socialism as a threat to their way of life, to their ideology. And when the Nazis said, we need your support to pass this Enabling Act so we can restore public order in Germany, because Germany was dealing with a lot of internal turmoil, the moderates said, sure. They weren't happy about it. They didn't, they weren't jumping with joy. But if they had refused to vote for this Enabling Act, the Nazi state would not have been established.
So could we say that these sort of moderate parties, their greatest goal, or one of their greatest goals, their main goal was to maintain the establishment?
Yes.
Maintain the status quo.
They saw that the Nazis had been put into power because people thought they could use them.
Yeah.
They could deal a sharp shock to the socialists and the communists, kick them in the backside, get them out the way, and the good old days would come back together again.
Yeah. So it was, just let's not stir things up.
Let's not stir things up. And this is one of the things that the socialists and the communists were perceived as doing, especially the communists. The socialists at this time, the SPD, were a moderate party. They were not the enemy.
They don't sound as crazy.
No.
Like as they might to us.
No, exactly. But they were working class, organized, industrial, urbanized, and they saw a different future. They didn't believe in the kind of the good old days of the Reich. They didn't believe in the good old days of nationalism. They wanted more for the people.
And that sounds to me like a certain corner, at least, of the Democratic Party. Maybe the part of the Democratic Party that is part of its future, which is younger, urban, all of those things.
The kind of people who listen to Bernie Sanders, the kind of people who listen to Elizabeth Warren, the kind of people who were passionate about Black Lives Matter, the kind of people who support the transgendered community in face of growing transphobia, young people in particular, young people who are not as frightened of words like socialism, who are not frightened of that kind of mindset, and the establishment doesn't like it. The establishment doesn't like extensive resistance because resistance can get out of hand. One of the things you learn about revolutions is they often start with very limited aims, very limited hopes. And then once you open up that bottle, everything comes out. The French Revolution did not start off with people being guillotined and the like. The Russian Revolution started off fairly kind of low-key in terms of what they hoped for. But when things didn't work out, they spiral, they become more radical. And I would guess that maybe many in the Democratic leadership feel they want to keep things on the down low. They just want they want the normal process to work itself out.
Are they afraid that, are you suggesting that they're afraid that if things start to get a little too radical, that they might wind up with their heads just symbolically on the guillotine?
I think that they would find themselves heading in exile over to the border into Canada.
Yeah. Well, we'll see about that.
In that they would, what they would lose is their connections, because their corporate sponsors would be like, you did do your job. Their part in the system would no longer be surplus to requirements.
So what was the difference with the socialists and the communists? They weren't afraid to go up against Hitler. First, let's talk a little bit about just what form did their opposition take?
Therefore, well, the communists in particular were involved in street battles with the Nazis.
Wow, they weren't holding back.
That was one of the reasons that the Nazis formed the storm troops, the Stormabteilung, was to protect the party from the communist threat. So they said the problem is that they were doing all the provoking themselves.
Right.
There were street battles between the communists, between the socialists.
So they were taking the fight to the street.
They were taking the fight to the streets. The socialists weren't as involved, but they were younger, radical socialists who weren't going to stand around being beaten in the head by the Nazis and their allies in the nationalist movements. There was a lot of street violence in Germany in the 20s and 30s. It was unstable. Could it have been resolved by more effective political leadership? Probably. Was it going to be? It would not be resolved by the Nazis. It would be silenced.
Right. So there was opposition, but it was fairly extreme opposition.
It was extreme in the sense like the communists and the socialists were not allied. They were kind of almost at each other's throats because the socialists were more moderate. The socialists were willing to work with the moderates. The socialists were willing to they had formed coalitions with the moderates in earlier years and had supported moderate governments because they believed in a moderate path towards revolution, or not revolution, but a moderate path towards change. And
is there a world in which there could have been some kind of, if the sort of the more mainstream parties, if that's the right term, if they had been more willing to sort of embrace the ideologies and the aims of the socialists, for example, could that have changed things as far as Hitler went?
If the socialists and the moderates had been working together before Hitler became chancellor, Hitler would never become chancellor.
Yeah.
The SPD, the socialists, had enough seats to kind of support governments. They could have supported the Zentrum and other parties. Even after, when Hitler became chancellor, though the Nazis and the nationalists had a majority, they didn't have a supermajority.
Right.
And the feeling was that they were going to be losing elections. If he hadn't given the public order everyone had looked for, if another election had been called, he would have lost more seats.
Yeah. So there was at various times a political solution to Hitler before the start of the war, obviously.
Yeah. Up until, I would say, probably anytime 1933, maybe up through 1933, the Enabling Act is the big one.
And that was when in
March 1933.
Right. So, but up until that point,
there was nothing inevitable but the Nazi state.
There was a political solution to be had.
And if various elements within, and I think this is going another topic for us as well, the establishment, when Hitler came into power, there was still plenty of time in the next couple of years when the establishment could have acted. The military could have done something.
Yeah.
And that's something we'll be talking about later on, especially with Trump's kind of shenanigans with the military leadership.
And I think we'll also be talking about where do individuals stand, citizens. Yeah. How can they oppose? How should they oppose? Where are they at? We're looking at that, you and I, and I'm sure everyone listening. We're watching that right now. We're not seeing a lot right now from average citizens, but we're watching.
We're hearing stories of town halls, for example, where even Republican town halls are having people asking what's going on with Medicare, what's going on with Medicaid.
So we're going to keep an eye on that and talk about that kind of opposition. But as far as political opposition goes, I think that right now, certainly citizens are they're hungry for their political leaders to do something, or at least to say something, to at least more openly challenge Trump. That's what I'm getting. Like today, for example, we're recording this on Monday, the 26th. 24th? What's today? It's the 24th. Thank you. Emmanuel Macron, president of France, met with Trump today. Yeah. And all over my Twitter feed is this video of Macron correcting Trump, as people call it, fact-checking him. Yeah. When Trump was talking about, the Europeans only gave money to Ukraine because, that was a loan. Yeah. And Macron's like, no, that was, we did not see that as a loan. And the fact that it's all over my Twitter feed and people are flipping out with joy over this says to me how desperately Americans want to see political leaders, preferably their political leaders, but they'll take a leader of France if they have to, calling out Trump openly and directly.
Exactly.
And there is just a real hunger for this, and I hope that maybe we'll see some of the Democratic leadership and some Republicans willing to just really call a spade instead of sitting on their hands and just hoping things work out.
And I think that because this is the challenge that we have of relying upon political leadership, is that who do they answer to?
Yeah.
Do they answer to the people who vote for them? Yeah. Or do they answer to the interests that are behind them? And I know that in the United States, they like to call themselves a democracy. They're not. It's an oligarchy.
And we'll talk about oligarchies, I think, sometime too. There's just so much to talk about. There's so much to unpack about what's going on here.
And the process of getting rid of Trump would be so more complicated. We live in Canada, where if we have a no vote of no confidence, and boom, the prime minister's gone.
So much. I mean, I'm sorry to say, parliamentary democracy is simply the superior form of democracy.
And one of the things you can look at is the inherent struggles of the Weimar Republic, the German state that Hitler would take over. But that's a much longer topic
for
of
another
conversation.
Day. But I think that wraps up today. Did you have anything else you wanted to add that
I'm good at this
get
end.
a chance to mention? Thanks for all that information about political parties in Nazi Germany, because I think there is a lot of this sense that Hitler just came in and strong-armed his way into power one way or another, and no, there were political solutions.
The one thing I'll just close with, one of the reasons that the political parties worked with Adolf Hitler was because they believed they could protect themselves.
Yeah.
In a matter of months, the parties were dissolved.
Yeah. So waiting around, maybe not the best way to go when things are spiraling like this.
Once you give Hitler the power to do whatever he wanted, surprise, surprise, he used it. And if that meant get rid of political parties who might be a source of resistance, you're gone, buddy.
Well, of course. And what else would you expect from someone who seeks to be a dictator? And we all know that's what Trump wants. He has said so himself. So the longer you wait for things to just work themselves out, the closer you're getting to being eliminated as even a threat to him.
And the people who you could have allied with to stop him, they themselves have been picked off.
Yeah.
The socialist movement was targeted very heavily by the Enabling Act.
Yeah. So there are ways that this can be done, but you can't wait around for things to happen.
Exactly.
You've got to take you got to take charge, and you got to take action.
They first came for the communists, then they came for the socialists, and then they came for, the poem by Pastor Niemöller.
Yeah, you can't wait.
No.
At times like this, you can't just assume that we're living in normal times. The sooner I feel like political leadership accepts that and is willing to have the courage to act for their constituents and not for their corporate donors and for the oligarchs, then the better off everyone will be.
Exactly.
But there's a lot of big question marks over the likelihood of that happening.
Exactly.
But it can make a difference is what we're really talking about.
Exactly.
It can make a difference if they're willing to.
If the parties had not voted for the Enabling Act, Hitler would have not had the powers he had.
That's all it would have taken.
Yeah.
So we'll wait and see and hope that our American listeners will encourage their political leaders to take action while they still can. I mean, not to be alarmist, but that's just kind of the reality that we're in.
There was a film of the life of Adolf Hitler, and one of the quotes that they used was, "Evil flourishes when good men do nothing."
Well, that's the truth.
It's a quote attributed to Edmund Burke. I don't think it is what he said, but it's a very good quote.
It's a really great point, and I think that is very much on topic for what's happening right now with a lot of the political leadership in the States right now. So you just have to, they have to ask themselves who they really answer to and what they're really there for.
Exactly.
So I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
And we'll keep an eye on that and keep an eye on many other things.
We will.
As the weeks unfold, who knows what's going to happen between now and next week, let alone now and next month, now and next year. But we're going to keep an eye on all of it and continue to discuss it. And we'd love to hear from you and what your thoughts are on all of this. You can find us on Twitter at CareeningPod and on Blue Sky also at CareeningPod. You can also email us at careeningpod@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on any of this. Drop us a comment if you're listening on a podcast app that allows that. Do subscribe, leave us a rating. We'd love to hear all of your feedback. And we look forward to talking to you again next week.
We do.
On Careening Towards Fascism.